welcome back. Before we begin, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight of the day settle out of your hands and out of your jaw, the way water finds the lowest place in a room and pools there, quiet and still. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while, nowhere you need to be. No problem waiting on the other side of this that cannot wait a few hours more. The only task in front of you now is to breathe a little slower than usual and to let my voice carry you somewhere far away from your own warm, safe bed. Because tonight we are going somewhere cold, somewhere deep beneath the stone, and the strange comfort of a place like that is that you get to visit it from here, wrapped in blankets, with a door you can lock and a light you can switch off whenever you please. The people we are about to meet had none of those small mercies. So let us be grateful for them, gently, and then let us go down the stairs together. Tonight, we are going to talk about the medieval dungeon, not the dungeon of films and fairy tales, with its dramatic torches and its rattling chains, though we will visit that imaginary place too. We are going to talk about the real thing, the damp, the dark, the long and patient cruelty of simply being forgotten beneath a building while the world above you went on without you. We are going to ask a simple question and answer it slowly in great and drowsy detail. If you had been locked away in a medieval dungeon, why wouldn't you have survived? It is a grim question, I know, but there is a particular kind of peace in hearing about hardship from a place of warmth, in learning how fragile life once was and how much we now take for granted. By the time we are finished, you will likely be asleep, and the cold stone we describe will feel very far away indeed. That is rather the point. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the forgotten corners of history, do consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps more sleepy travelers find their way here to this quiet little place where the past is only ever told softly and only ever to help you rest. And while you are settling in, I would love it if you left a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what the time is there right now. It is a lovely thing, drifting off to sleep, knowing that somewhere out there, in a different time zone entirely, someone else is closing their eyes to the very same story. So, the fire above is burning low, the household is asleep, and there is a door in the floor of an old, cold castle that almost nobody ever opens. Let us open it now, you and I, very quietly, and let us go down. Close your eyes if they are not already closed, and picture a dungeon. I suspect we are picturing very nearly the same thing. A round chamber of black, dripping stone, a single torch guttering in an iron bracket, chains bolted to the wall, and a skeleton still hanging in them, grinning at nothing. Perhaps a rack in the corner. Perhaps a barred window high above, far too high to reach, letting in one thin and useless blade of moonlight. The air is thick. Somewhere, water drips. Somewhere further off, someone is screaming. It is a wonderful picture. It is vivid and theatrical, and it has frightened and delighted audiences for centuries. And it is, for the most part, completely wrong. The dungeon of our imagination is largely an invention of much later ages. It was dreamed up by Victorian novelists and Gothic painters, by film sets and theme parks, by people who wanted the medieval world to be as dark and dramatic as possible, because darkness and drama sell tickets. The real medieval world was certainly capable of great cruelty, but it was cruel in ways that were stranger, quieter, and in some respects far more unsettling than a torch and a skeleton could ever convey. Let us begin with the word itself. The word dungeon comes to us from the old French word donjon, and a donjon was not a pit at all. It was the great central tower of a castle, the strongest, tallest, proudest part of the whole structure. The keep, the place the Lord himself would retreat to if the outer walls were ever breached. In other words, the original dungeon was the safest and grandest room in the building, not the lowest and foulest. How the word traveled downward from the Lord's high tower to the prisoner's low cell is its own small history. Over time, the lower levels of these great towers came to be used for storage, and then, here and there, for holding people, and the word slid down with them, sinking floor by floor through the centuries, until it came to mean the very opposite of what it once had. The proud tower became the buried hole. There is something almost poetic in that, if you are in the mood to find it. But here is the first thing you must understand, the thing that changes everything else. For most of the medieval period, in most of medieval Europe, prison was not a punishment. It was a waiting room. This is a difficult idea for us to hold because we live in a world built around the prison sentence. We measure crime in years. We say a person was given 10 years, or 20, or life, and we picture them living out that time behind bars, and we call that justice. But the medieval mind did not think this way at all. To them, locking a person in a room for years on end, feeding and housing them at someone else's expense, was not justice. It was a baffling waste. Why would you spend good bread keeping a wrongdoer alive in idleness? Medieval justice, when it fell, tended to fall quickly. A person found guilty of a serious crime might be fined, or have their property seized, or be publicly shamed in the stocks where their neighbors could throw rotten food and worse. They might be branded or banished from the town entirely, sent out the gates to fend for themselves in a world where a stranger with no kin and no home was a very vulnerable thing indeed. Or, for the gravest crimes, they might be put to death, swiftly, publicly, and with a great deal of ceremony. So if prison was not the punishment, then what was the dungeon for? Who were all these people sitting in the dark? The answer is that the dungeon was, overwhelmingly, a place of waiting. You were not there to serve a sentence. You were there because the wheels of the world had not yet finished turning around you, and someone needed to keep you in one place while they did. Perhaps you were waiting for your trial. Perhaps you were waiting for a ransom to be paid, your freedom hanging on whether someone, somewhere, valued you enough to send the coins. Perhaps you were a debtor, locked away until your debts were settled, which is a particularly cruel kind of cage, because a person in a cell can rarely earn the money to free themselves from it. Perhaps you were a political inconvenience, a rival, a claimant, a nuisance to someone powerful, and your imprisonment was less about anything you had done and more about keeping you tidily out of the way. Hold that thought because it will follow us all the way down. The medieval dungeon was rarely a place of clear-cut villains paying for clear-cut crimes. It was a place of the in-between, the accused and the unconvicted, the unlucky and the inconvenient. People in the long gray pause between one thing and the next, waiting for a future that for a great many of them would never come. And so the question we are asking tonight, why you would not survive, has a more complicated answer than you might expect. You would not be killed by the dungeon, usually. The dungeon did not need to kill you. It only needed to hold you and wait and let the cold and the damp and the hunger and the small invisible creatures do the slow work that no executioner was being paid to do. That is the truth we will be uncovering, one soft layer at a time. The dungeon rarely struck a blow, it simply outlasted you. Let us imagine, then, how you came to be here. Let us build your particular misfortune from the ground up, so that when we put you in the cell, you will understand exactly how you arrived. You are not, I think, a hardened criminal. Very few people in the dungeon were. You are an ordinary person, of the kind this channel loves best. A weaver, perhaps, or a baker, or a farmer who came into town to sell a cart of turnips. You have a family, or you had one. You have a trade, or the memory of one. You are, in every way that matters, a person much like yourself, dropped into a world without antibiotics, without streetlights, and without very much in the way of mercy for those who could not pay for it. There are 100 quiet roads that might have led you here. Let us walk a few of them, because each one tells us something about the world above the dungeon, the world that fed it with bodies. The first road is debt. This is, perhaps surprisingly, one of the most common reasons an ordinary person found themselves behind a locked door. You borrowed money or you bought goods on credit, as nearly everyone did, because coin was scarce and trust was the currency that kept villages and towns alive. And then the harvest failed, or the customer who owed you didn't pay, or the man you owed grew impatient and unkind. And so you were taken, not because you were wicked, but because you were poor at the wrong moment. The cruelty of the debtor's cell, as we said, is its hopelessness. A free man might labor his way out of debt. A caged man could only wait and hope and watch the debt grow as the cost of his own imprisonment was added to it day by day. The second road is accusation. Someone said you did something. Perhaps you did, sir, perhaps you didn't. In a world without police as we know them, without forensic science, without any reliable way of establishing what had truly happened, an accusation carried tremendous and terrible weight. A neighbor's grudge, a rival's lie, a misunderstanding that grew legs and ran. You might be seized on the strength of a single pointing finger and held until someone with authority could be bothered to decide what to do with you. That deciding could take a very long time. The third road is suspicion of something larger. Heresy, perhaps, treason, witchcraft in the later centuries. These were the accusations that made the powerful nervous, and a nervous, powerful person is a dangerous thing to be near. To be suspected of threatening the church or the crown was to find yourself in a deeper, darker, more closely guarded sort of cell, and to discover that the rules which protected ordinary prisoners, such as they were, did not always apply to you. The fourth road, and one we forget, is simply being on the wrong side. Wars and feuds and quarrels between great families filled the dungeons of Europe with people whose only crime was loyalty to a losing cause. A knight captured in battle, a messenger carrying the wrong letter, a lord's daughter held to guarantee her father's good behavior. These were valuable prisoners, often, and valuable prisoners were sometimes treated rather well, because a corpse cannot be ransomed, and a corpse cannot be bargained with. But valuable or not, they were prisoners all the same, and a comfortable cage is still a cage. However you came, the journey itself would have been frightening. Picture it: the hands on your arms, the faces of your neighbors turning to watch, some pitying, some merely curious, a few perhaps secretly pleased, the walk through the town, or the road, or the gate, and then the castle rising ahead of you, that great pile of stone that had loomed over your whole life as a symbol of protection and order, now opening its mouth to swallow you. You would be led in through a side door, most likely, or down a stair, away from the bright halls where the household lived and ate and laughed. The sounds of ordinary life would fade behind you. The light would change, growing thinner and bluer and colder. The air would change too, taking on that particular smell of deep stone, mineral, and damp and very old, the smell of a place the sun has never warmed. And then a door, a heavy one, iron bands across thick oak, or perhaps a grill of bars, or perhaps simply a trap door in the floor with a ladder leading down into the black. Someone would draw a bolt or turn a great key, and the sound of it would be the loudest thing you had ever heard, because you would understand in that moment that the same sound would have to happen in reverse before you could ever leave. Take a slow breath here in your warm bed and let yourself feel how very different your own situation is. Your door is closed because you chose to close it. The lock, if there is one, is on your side. No one is turning a key against your will. You are held here by nothing but your own comfort and your own tiredness, and you may rise and walk out into the lit world at any moment you choose. Feel the difference. Let it make the blankets feel a little warmer, and then come back down the stair with me, because there is more to see. To understand the cell, you must first understand the building that held it, because the dungeon was never a thing apart. It was a small dark organ inside a large living body, and the body was the castle. We tend to think of castles as romantic ruins, softened by ivy and centuries, the sort of place you visit on a gray afternoon and photograph from a respectful distance. But a working medieval castle was none of those things. It was loud. It was crowded. It was a fortress and a farmhouse, and a courthouse and a counting house, and a barracks and a home, all crammed into one defensible heap of stone, and it was full, from dawn to dusk, of people. Above your cell, the castle hummed with life. There were soldiers drilling in the yard, and grooms in the stables, and a smith hammering at his forge until the whole structure seemed to ring with it. There were cooks in a kitchen the size of a barn, roasting and boiling and baking for the dozens or hundreds of mouths the household had to feed. There were servants carrying water and wood and washing. There were clerks bent over ledgers, and chaplains at their prayers, and somewhere in the finest rooms, the Lord and his family living a life of relative comfort, with tapestries on the walls to keep out the drafts, and fires kept burning in great hearths. And all of it, every footstep, and every shout, and every clang of the smith's hammer would have reached you faintly through the stone. This is one of the cruelties we rarely think about. You were not in a silent void. You were buried alive beneath a party you could not attend. You could hear the muffled rhythm of ordinary days passing over your head, the world going on exactly as before, indifferent to the fact that you had fallen out of it. There is a particular loneliness in that. To be so close to warmth and company and the smell of cooking, and yet to be utterly cut off from all of it by a few feet of stone and a locked door. Now, where exactly within this great building would you be held? Here we must abandon another piece of the imagined dungeon, because the answer is it depended enormously on who you were. If you were a person of rank, a noble captured in war, a political prisoner of high birth, you might not be in a pit at all. You might be held in a chamber in one of the upper floors of a tower, a real room with a real window, perhaps even with a fireplace and a bed and a servant or two of your own. Your imprisonment was guaranteed not by darkness and chains, but by walls and guards, and the simple fact that there was nowhere to run. The medieval world understood perfectly well that a prisoner of high value was an asset, and you do not let your assets rot. You keep them in good condition, the way you would keep a fine horse, until the day you can exchange them for something you want. But if you were an ordinary person, a debtor, or an accused thief, or a nuisance to someone powerful, your accommodation was considerably less generous. You might be held in a guard room, or a converted cellar, or a chamber within the gatehouse, which was often used for holding because it was already strong and already watched. And in some castles, yes, there was a true low place, a chamber cut into the rock or built into the very foundations, beneath the level of the ground, where the damp came up through the floor and the only light was what fell through a grill from the room above. And then, in the most feared cases, there was a particular kind of cell that the imagination did get right, more or less. A cell with no door in any wall, because the only way in or out was a hole in the ceiling. We will come to that one shortly, and I will tell you its name and the strange and terrible idea that gave it that name. But not yet. Let us not rush toward the worst of it. We have all night. For now, simply hold this picture in your mind as you drift. A great stone castle, alive and busy and warm in its upper rooms, going about the ordinary business of 1,000 ordinary days. And then, somewhere beneath it, down past the storerooms and the wine cellars and the foundations, a small cold space where a person sits in the half dark, listening to the muffled life above and waiting, always waiting. The castle was a clock, and the dungeon was the still, dark place at its very center, where for one unlucky soul the hands had stopped moving altogether. I promised you a name, and now I will give it to you, softly, the way you give someone bad news when there is no longer any hurry. The cell I mentioned, the one with no door, the one you entered through a hole in the ceiling and could never leave the same way, has a name that tells you everything about its purpose. It was called an oubliette. The word comes from the French verb oublier, which means to forget. An oubliette, then, is a place of forgetting, a place where a person is put not to be kept, not to be tried, not to be ransomed, but simply to be forgotten, to be removed from the world so completely and so finally that even the act of remembering them becomes too much trouble. It is, I think, one of the saddest words ever invented. There is no anger in it, no drama, just the quiet administrative cruelty of deciding that a human being is no longer worth thinking about. Now, I must be honest with you, because honesty is part of what makes a story restful rather than merely frightening. Historians argue about how common true oubliettes really were. Some of the famous examples shown to tourists today were probably storerooms, or cisterns for collecting water, or simple cellars that later, more romantic generations decided must have been dungeons, because the idea was so deliciously grim. The medieval world was cruel, but it was also practical, and a hole that you cannot easily get a body out of is, from a practical standpoint, rather inconvenient. But the idea of the oubliette was real, even where the architecture has been exaggerated. The principle behind it, the notion that a prisoner could simply be dropped into the dark and left, was real. And there were certainly places, deep, narrow shafts of stone reached only from above, where a person could be lowered down, and where climbing out unaided was simply impossible. Whether you call it an oubliette or a bottle dungeon, or simply a very deep and very nasty hole, the experience would have been much the same. Let us imagine it gently from a safe distance. Oh, you are brought to the edge of an opening in the floor. You cannot see the bottom. A rope is fastened or a ladder lowered, and you are made to go down into a space that narrows as it descends, shaped a little like the inside of a bottle, wide at the base and tight at the neck. And then the rope is drawn up, or the ladder is taken away, and the opening above you is closed, and the small gray coin of light that marked it shrinks and vanishes. And now you are in the dark, not the dark of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, where your eyes adjust and shapes emerge, and a little light always seems to find its way in from somewhere. This is the other dark, the complete dark, the dark of deep stone, where there is genuinely no light at all, where your eyes strain and find nothing to fasten on, where you cannot tell whether they are open or closed. People who have experienced true darkness of this kind often describe how quickly it stops feeling like an absence of light and starts feeling like a presence in itself, a thing with weight, a thing that presses. In a place like this, the senses you have left would grow desperately sharp. You would learn the precise shape of your prison by touch, your fingers reading the cold curve of the walls, finding every crack and every patch of slime, mapping a world perhaps no larger than the space you are lying in right now. You would learn its sounds, the drip of water finding its way down through the rock, the skitter of small clawed feet, the vast, low silence of the stone itself, which is not really silence at all, but a kind of pressure on the ears. And you would learn its smells, which we will not dwell on, except to say that a place with no light and no air and no way out becomes very quickly a place that smells of everything that has happened in it. How long might a person last in such a place? It depended, as everything did, on whether anyone remembered to feed them. And the whole point of the oubliette, the cruelty woven into its very name, was that you could not be sure anyone would. A prisoner in an ordinary cell could at least cling to a routine. The jailer comes at such a time, the bread arrives, the day has a shape, but the forgotten prisoner had lost even that. Each time the grill above opened and a little food was lowered down, you would not know whether it was the last time, and each time it did not open, you would not know whether it ever would again. But let us not leave you down there, because that is not the purpose of this telling. Rise up out of the imagined dark now, the way a diver rises slowly toward the bright surface of the water. Come back up through the stone, back into the warm and quiet room where you are lying, where the dark around you is the soft, friendly dark of nighttime, full of the faint and comforting sounds of a safe house at rest. Your dark has an edge to it, a door, a morning waiting on the other side. Feel the difference and let it hold you, and let us climb back up the stair to talk of gentler miseries. Let us suppose now that you are not in the worst of all possible cells. Let us be kind to you, as kind as a dungeon allows, and place you instead in an ordinary one, a chamber of stone, below ground or nearly so, with a heavy door and perhaps a small barred opening through which the dim light of a corridor reaches you. This was the lot of most prisoners. Not the dramatic horror of the oubliette, but a long, gray, grinding ordinariness that wore a person down so slowly they might hardly notice it happening. The first thing you would notice, and the thing that would never, ever leave you, is the cold. Stone is a thief of warmth. A thick stone wall, particularly one below the level of the ground, sits at the temperature of the earth around it, which in most of Europe is cool the year round and bitter in winter. And stone does not simply fail to warm you. It actively pulls the heat out of your body, drinking it up through every point of contact, through the floor you sit on, and the wall you lean against, and the very air that hangs heavy and chill around you. You would have had little to defend yourself with. Perhaps the clothes you were arrested in, and nothing more. Perhaps if you were fortunate or could pay, a thin blanket or a scattering of straw on the floor. Straw was the great medieval comfort, the bedding of the poor and the prisoner alike, and a fresh armful of it was a real and meaningful kindness. But straw in a damp cell does not stay fresh. It grows sodden and foul and cold, matting down into a sour layer that offers very little against the relentless chill rising from beneath. And that brings us to the damp, which was in many ways worse than the cold, because the two of them work together against you. Below ground, water is always trying to get in. It seeps through the stone, it beads on the walls, it pools on the floor, it hangs in the air as a clammy, penetrating moisture that finds its way into everything. Your clothes would never be quite dry. Your straw would never be quite dry. Your skin, your hair, the very bread you were given to eat, all of it would carry that damp. And damp cold is a cold that gets into the bones in a way that dry cold never does. It is the cold of a cave, of a cellar, of a grave. Think for a moment about what constant damp does to a person over weeks and months. The skin softens and cracks. Small wounds will not heal because a wound needs to dry to close, and nothing here ever dried. Joints ache and stiffen. The lungs, breathing that thick wet air day and night, grow congested and weak, and a cough that might be nothing in a warm, dry house becomes in a cold, wet cell a slow and dangerous thing. Many a prisoner who was never sentenced to die, who was perhaps entirely innocent, who was merely waiting for a trial that kept being delayed, simply coughed and shivered their way out of the world, killed not by any judge, but by the plain physical fact of the room they were kept in. And over all of it lay the dark. Not the total dark of the oubliette, but a chronic gray, sunless dimness. A cell might have a small window, but it would be small indeed, and high and barred, and in a deep cell it might open only onto another interior space rather than onto the sky. The medieval world had no way to light a dungeon brightly, even if it had wished to. Candles and lamp oil cost money, and money was not spent on the comfort of prisoners. So you would live in a perpetual twilight, your eyes never quite resting because there was never quite enough light to see by, and never quite enough darkness to sleep in either. And here is a subtle cruelty that we, with our bright electric world, can scarcely imagine. Without proper light, you would lose track of time. The days would blur. With no clear sense of dawn or dusk, no clock, no calendar, you would quickly lose your grip on how long you had been there. Was it 3 weeks? 3 months? The seasons themselves might pass almost unmarked, registered only as a deepening or easing of the cold. Time, which is supposed to be the one thing that carries us forward and out of our troubles, became in the dungeon just another part of the prison. You could not even count the days that separated you from freedom, because you could no longer count the days at all. It is a heavy thing to imagine, the cold and the wet and the endless gray. But notice as you lie there in your bed how every single one of these miseries is absent from your own night. Your room is warm, or warm enough. Your bedding is dry and soft, gathered around you exactly as you like it. You know what time it is, more or less, and you know that morning will come at its usual hour and bring its usual light. You are held in the dark, yes, but it is your dark, and it is kind, and it asks nothing of you but that you let it carry you off to sleep. Let the contrast soften you. Let it loosen something in your chest, and breathe. Let us spend a little while with the chains, because here, at least, the imagined dungeon and the real one come closer together, and the truth is worth understanding properly rather than through the haze of films and paintings. Irons were real, shackles were real. The clank and drag of metal was a genuine sound of the medieval prison, but the why and the how of it were more practical and stranger than we tend to suppose. Understand first that iron was not cheap. It had to be mined and smelted and worked by a skilled smith, and so a set of fetters represented real value, real expense. This alone tells you that not every prisoner was chained, because not every prisoner was worth the iron it would take to chain them. Restraints were used where they were needed, on the dangerous, the violent, the desperate, the high flight risks, and on those whose captors wished, for whatever reason, to make their suffering plain. The ordinary debtor, weak with hunger in a cell he could not have broken out of in any case, often wore no irons at all. Where would he have gone? The cold and the locked door were chain enough. But where irons were used, they were a misery all their own, a misery layered on top of all the others. Picture a heavy ring of iron closed around each ankle, joined by a chain, the whole weight of it dragging at you with every movement, every shift, every attempt to find a more bearable position on the cold stone. The metal was hard and unyielding against the soft skin of the ankle and the wrist, and over time it would rub and chafe and break the skin, and the broken skin in that filthy, damp place would not heal but fester. There are records of prisoners whose flesh grew over and around their irons in the end, the body and its prison slowly becoming a single thing. And the irons, like everything else in the prison, had their price. We spoke earlier of the jailer's economy, of how every comfort could be bought and every cruelty eased for the right coin. The weight of a prisoner's irons was very much part of this dark commerce. A prisoner with money might pay to have his fetters lightened, to have a heavier set exchanged for a lighter one, or removed altogether, while a prisoner with nothing wore whatever the jailer chose to leave on him. There was even a particular cruelty, recorded in some places, of loading a prisoner with the heaviest possible irons, precisely so that he would pay to have them eased, a kind of extortion practiced upon the body itself. Think of what it would mean to live like this, day after day, month after month. The constant weight, the constant cold of the metal, which never warmed to the body but drank its heat the way the stone walls did, the slow, grinding damage to the skin and the joints, the sheer awkwardness of every small act of trying to sleep, to rise, to eat, to relieve oneself, with the iron always there, always dragging, always reminding you with its weight and its sound that you were held. The chains did not need to be the dramatic, wall bolted manacles of the imagination to break a person down. The simple, patient weight of a set of ankle irons, worn long enough, did the work just as surely. And yet, even here, the human spirit found its small rebellions. Prisoners learned to pad their irons with rags, where they could, to wrap cloth between the metal and the skin and win themselves a little relief. They learned to move in ways that spared the worst of the chafing, to position the chains so they dragged less, to make the unbearable a fraction more bearable through patience and ingenuity. It is a small thing, this learning to live with the iron, but it speaks to something I keep returning to tonight, the astonishing capacity of human beings to adapt, to endure, to wring some thin thread of bearability out of conditions that ought, by rights, to be utterly unbearable. Let the weight of all that iron fall away from you now, as you lie here unbound and unburdened in the warm. Feel how light your own body is, how free to turn and stretch and settle exactly as it pleases. There is no metal at your ankles. There is nothing holding you but the soft gravity of your own tiredness, drawing you down gently toward sleep. Let yourself feel for just a moment the simple luxury of being unchained. It is a freedom so complete that we never think of it at all, and it is yours entirely tonight. You would not, I am sorry to say, be alone down there, even in solitary confinement, even forgotten in the deepest cell. You would have company, and it was not the kind of company that brought any comfort. Let us begin with the rats, since they are the creatures the imagination reaches for first, and for once, the imagination is not far wrong. Rats thrived in the medieval world. They thrived in the towns, in the granaries, in the ships, in the ditches, and they certainly thrived in the dungeons, where the dark suited them and where a steady trickle of scraps, and worse, drew them in. A prisoner sharing a cell with rats would hear them long before learning to ignore them. The scratch of claws on stone, the soft, heavy movement in the straw, the bright, disturbing sound of them gnawing, patiently, at anything that could be gnawed. For a strong and waking prisoner, rats were mostly a horror of the mind, a thing that made the skin crawl rather than a true danger. But for the weak, the sick, the sleeping, the dying, they were something worse, and I will leave the details of that to your imagination rather than place them in your mind as you drift toward sleep. It is enough to say that the rat was a constant presence, a reminder that in the dungeon you were not the only creature waiting, and not always the one most at home. But the rats, for all that we fear them, were not the real danger. The real danger was far smaller, and you would have carried it on your own body. I mean the lice and the fleas and the other tiny travelers that lived in the seams of clothing and the warmth of human hair and skin. In the medieval world, these were near universal. Rich and poor alike were rarely free of them. But in the dungeon, where you could not wash, could not change your clothes, could not pick through your seams in good light. They multiplied without check until your own skin became a hunting ground, itching and crawling and never ever still. And it is here, with these tiny creatures, that we arrive at the true killer of the medieval prison. Not the cold alone, not the hunger alone, not the rats, not the jailer. The thing that emptied the dungeons of Europe more reliably than any executioner was a disease, and it had a name that tells you exactly where it lived. They called it jail fever. We know it today as typhus. Typhus is a disease carried by lice, passed from one person to the next as the lice move between bodies crowded close together. And the dungeon was the most perfect breeding ground for it that could possibly be designed. Prisoners crammed together in filth, unable to wash, unable to escape one another's vermin, weakened already by cold and hunger and damp. The disease would take hold in one cell and sweep through the rest, and a prison that had been merely miserable would become, almost overnight, a place of fever and death. The numbers, where we have them, are genuinely staggering. In later centuries, when records were kept more carefully, it was observed again and again that jail fever killed far more prisoners than the hangman ever did. There were courtrooms where the disease, carried in from the prison on the bodies of the accused, leapt to the judges and lawyers and onlookers and killed them too, so that the trial itself became a death sentence for the very people running it. The dungeon, in other words, did not keep its cruelty contained. It reached up through the floor and out through the doors and touched the world above as well. Think of what this means for our question tonight. Why would you not survive a medieval dungeon? Here, perhaps, is the plainest answer of all. You would not survive because survival was, in a real and measurable sense, simply not very likely. You could be the most innocent person in the world. You could be perfectly healthy on the day you were taken. And still the lice would find you, and the fever would find the lice, and your fate would have nothing to do with justice or guilt or anything you had done or left undone. It would be decided by biology, in the dark, while you waited for a trial that the fever might reach before the judge did. I know this is a heavy stretch of our journey, so let us pause here and breathe through it together. In your own warm bed, you are clean or clean enough. Your sheets are fresh. The small, invisible creatures that plagued nearly every human being for nearly all of history have in your life been pushed almost entirely out of the picture by soap and hot water and the simple miracle of being able to wash. These are not small things. They are among the greatest gifts our age has given us, and we so rarely stop to feel grateful for them. So feel it now, just for a moment, the cleanliness, the warmth, the safety of your own untroubled skin, and let that gratitude settle over you like a clean, dry blanket as we move on. Let us talk now about food and about one of the strangest truths of the medieval dungeon, a truth that surprises almost everyone who hears it. In most cases, the prison did not feed you, or rather, it did not feed you well, and it was not at all obliged to. We carry an assumption, born of the modern world, that a prisoner will at least be kept alive, that whoever holds the key has a basic duty to provide bread and water, however meager. The medieval world did not necessarily share this assumption. In many places and many periods, Feeding a prisoner was not seen as the jailer's duty at all. It was the prisoner's own problem. And if the prisoner could not solve that problem, the prisoner could starve, and frequently did. Imagine the position this put you in. You are locked in a cell, you cannot work, cannot trade, cannot leave, and yet you are expected somehow to provide for your own feeding. How? The answer was that you relied on the world outside the walls, on family who might bring you food, if you had family, and if they were permitted to reach you, and if they were not too poor or too frightened to come, on charity, the alms of the pious, who considered the visiting and feeding of prisoners to be a holy act, and who sometimes left bequests in their wills to provide bread for the captives of a particular town. On your own coins, if you had managed to keep any, with which you might buy food from the jailer himself. And here we come to one of the most important figures in the whole grim story, the jailer. Because the jailer, in the medieval and early modern prison, was very often not paid a proper wage to do his job. Instead, he was permitted, even expected, to make his living from the prisoners themselves. He sold them their food, he sold them their drink, he sold them straw and candles and the small mercies of a slightly better cell or a slightly lighter set of irons. The prison was, in a very real sense, his business, and the prisoners were his customers, whether they wished to be or not. This produced a system of almost unbelievable cruelty, though it was rarely cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was simply business, conducted on people who had no power to refuse. Everything had a price. There was even a word, in the English prisons of later centuries, for the fee a prisoner had to pay simply to be admitted, and another for the fee to be released once their case was settled, so that a person found innocent might still languish in their cell, unable to leave, because they could not afford the charge for the privilege of walking out the door. Imagine that particular despair. To be declared free and to remain caged, because freedom itself carried a price you could not pay. So your survival, once again, came down to money and to mercy. A prisoner with coins, or with loving family, or with the good fortune to be held in a town with a strong tradition of charity toward captives, might eat tolerably and live. A prisoner with none of these, a stranger, a pauper, a person whose family had abandoned them or been forbidden to visit, might quite simply waste away. There are records, scattered through the centuries, of prisoners dying of hunger in their cells, not because anyone had ordered their death, but because no one had thought to order their life, and the food that would have kept them was never bought because no one was there to buy it. What food there was, when there was any, was the plainest imaginable, bread above all. Coarse, dark bread, often stale, sometimes made from the cheapest and roughest grain, the kind that the household above would not deign to eat. Water, of course, though water in the medieval world was a dangerous drink, often foul, and the cause of as much sickness as it cured. Thin ale was safer if you could get it, the weak everyday brew that even children drank, because the brewing made it cleaner than the water it was made from. And on a good day, in a kinder prison, perhaps a little broth, a few vegetables, the scrapings of the kitchen above. But never enough, never quite enough, and so you would be hungry, not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, which you and I know and which passes, but the deep, settled, permanent hunger of a body that is never given enough to do its work. This kind of hunger changes a person. It makes them cold because the body has no fuel to burn for warmth. It makes them weak and listless and slow in their thoughts. It makes them vulnerable to every passing sickness because a starved body cannot defend itself. The hunger and the cold and the damp and the lice all work together, you see, each one opening the door a little wider for the others, until the prisoner who had walked in strong was after weeks or months a thin and shivering shadow, waiting for whatever would come first, the trial, or the fever, or simply the end. Let us set that hunger down now, and let us not carry it with us into sleep. In your own life, food is so near and so certain that you rarely think of it as a blessing at all. There is bread in your kitchen, there is more than bread. You have never, I hope, known the long hunger we have been describing, the hunger with no bottom to it. Let that certainty be a comfort to you tonight. Your body is fed and warm and resting. It has everything it needs to carry you safely through to the morning. There is nothing it lacks. Let it rest. If you are still with me and still awake, I would love for you to do one small thing before you drift the rest of the way down. In the quiet of your own mind, or in a comment if you are not yet too sleepy, tell me this. If you had lived in those times, who would you have wanted to come and visit you? Whose face would you have hoped to see at the grill of your cell, bringing bread and news of the world above? It is a strange and tender thing to think about, and there is no need to answer it tonight. Just let the question drift through you, soft as smoke, and carry on resting. We have a little further to go. We touched a moment ago on the jailer and his little kingdom of fees, but the economy of the medieval prison is worth lingering over, because nothing reveals the true nature of the dungeon quite so clearly as following the money. And there was money in the dungeon. There was always money in the dungeon, flowing in one direction only, out of the prisoner and into the hands of those who held the keys. Let us begin with the idea that almost everything could be bought, and therefore almost everything could be denied. Were you cold, a better cell, one nearer the surface, with a little more light and a little less damp, could be had for a price. Were your irons heavy and chafing, a lighter set, or the removal of them altogether, could be arranged for a price. Were you hungry? The jailer kept a stock of food and drink, and would sell it to you gladly, often at prices far above what the same food cost in the market above, because where else were you going to shop? This meant that the experience of imprisonment varied enormously between one prisoner and the next, even within the same prison, even within the same week. Two people might be locked behind the same kind of door, accused of the same kind of crime, and live in entirely different worlds. The one with coins ate and slept on straw and kept a candle burning against the dark, and perhaps even received visitors and wine. The one without coins shivered in the black and the wet and went hungry, and watched the wealthier prisoners' small comforts with a longing we can scarcely imagine. Money did not just make the dungeon more bearable. Money was, very often, the difference between living and dying in it. There is a phrase from the later English prisons that captures all of this with a kind of grim poetry. They spoke of being on the master's side, or the common side. The master's side was for those who could pay. It had beds and food and a measure of dignity, and a far better chance of walking out alive. The common side was for the poor, and it was a place of crowding and filth and fever, where the death rate was appalling, and where charity was the only thing standing between a prisoner and the grave. The same building, the same sentence of waiting, two completely different fates, decided by nothing more than the weight of your purse on the day you were taken. And consider the cruel circularity of it all, especially for the debtor. You were imprisoned because you owed money. While imprisoned, you could not earn money. Yet your imprisonment itself cost money, the fees for your cell and your food and your very existence piling up day by day. So the debt that put you in the cell grew larger the longer you stayed, and the longer you stayed, the more impossible it became to ever pay it off and leave. It was a trap that tightened the more you struggled against it, a hole that grew deeper the longer you stood in it. Some debtors spent years this way, some spent the rest of their lives. It would be easy, hearing all this, to imagine the jailer as a monster, and some of them surely were, but many were simply ordinary men doing an ordinary job in a system that was rotten from top to bottom. They were poorly paid, or not paid at all, and told to make their living from the prisoners, and so they did. In the same way, a shopkeeper makes his living from his customers, with no particular malice, only the steady pressure of a man who has his own family to feed. The cruelty of the medieval prison was rarely the cruelty of individual wicked people. It was the cruelty of a system that had decided quietly and without ever quite saying so out loud that the comfort and even the survival of a prisoner was simply not anyone's responsibility. And in that decision, far more than in any torture chamber, lay the real horror of the place. Let the strangeness of all this wash over you as you rest. We live in a world with its own injustices, its own cruelties, but the particular nightmare of having to purchase your own survival, coin by coin, from the very person who holds you captive, is one that most of us will never know. There is a roof over you tonight that no one is charging you to sleep beneath. There is warmth that costs you nothing in this moment. Let that ease you. Let it loosen your shoulders one notch further. And let us go and meet the people you would have shared all this with. A dungeon, for all its loneliness, was rarely truly empty, and the people you would have found yourself among are perhaps the most interesting part of the whole story, because they were not, by and large, the snarling villains of our imagination. They were a strange and varied collection of the unlucky, and in their company you might have found, of all things, a kind of fellowship. There would have been debtors, as we have said, often a great many of them, for debt filled the prisons more reliably than almost anything else. These were ordinary tradespeople and laborers and even merchants who had simply fallen on the wrong side of fortune, and they would have talked endlessly of the businesses they had lost and the money they were owed and the day they were sure was coming when it would all be set right. Some of them were old hands who had been there for years and knew the ways of the place, who could tell you which jailer might be softened and which never would, where the least damp corner was, how to make a heel of bread last. There would have been the accused, people like yourself, waiting for trials that crept toward them with agonizing slowness. Some frightened, some defiant, some sunk in a despair so deep they hardly spoke at all. You would have heard their stories, true and false and half of each, the endless protestations of innocence, the bitter accounts of the neighbor or the rival or the false witness who had put them there, and you would have learned quickly that guilt and innocence were not written on people's faces, that the gentlest soul in the cell might be a genuine murderer, and the most frightening might be a wronged and harmless man, and that in here none of it mattered very much anyway, because the dungeon made no distinction between them. There might have been political prisoners if your dungeon was grand enough to hold them, kept apart in their better cells, but glimpsed sometimes, or whispered about. Fallen courtiers, defeated rebels, the wrong claimant to some title or throne. These were figures of fascination to the ordinary prisoners, links to the great world of power that had in its careless way swept them all up together. And there might have been the truly desperate, the violent, the broken, the ones the dungeon had already half destroyed, who muttered in the dark, and whom even the other prisoners learned to avoid. And there would have been, threading through all of it, the small human kindnesses that survive even in the worst places. A prisoner sharing bread with one who had none, an old hand teaching a newcomer the unspoken rules, someone holding the hand of a man dying of fever so that he would not go alone into the dark. We must not paint the dungeon as a place of pure horror, because that would be a lie, and the truth is gentler and stranger. Human beings, even crushed together in cold and filth and fear, remain human beings. They form friendships, they tell jokes, they look out for one another sometimes in small and stubborn ways. The light of ordinary decency does not go out just because the sun cannot reach it. Picture them, then, your companions in this imagined captivity, the talkative debtor with his endless schemes, the frightened young man awaiting trial, the wise old prisoner who has seen it all and somehow kept his kindness, the quiet one in the corner, the one who is failing, and the ones who sit with him. A whole small society, formed in the dark, bound together by nothing but the shared misfortune of being here. There is something almost beautiful in it, hidden inside all the sorrow, and it is worth holding on to. Even in the deepest dungeon, no one was ever quite as alone as the architecture intended them to be. We have said again and again that the dungeon was a place of waiting, so let us now look more closely at what exactly you would have been waiting for and why it took so very long. Because the slowness of medieval justice was not an accident or an oversight. It was woven into the very nature of the world, and understanding it helps us understand why so many people simply died in their cells before justice, in any form, ever arrived. First, you must understand that justice in the medieval world was not a smooth and constant machine. It came around in many places only occasionally, like a comet. In England, for instance, serious cases in the countryside often had to wait for the arrival of traveling judges who rode a circuit through the land holding court in one town after another. These visits might come only once or twice a year, so if you were arrested shortly after the judges had passed through, you might wait many long months through an entire turn of the seasons before there was anyone with the authority to try you at all. And you would wait in the cell while the cold came and went, and the fever circled, and your strength drained away. And the trial itself, when it finally came, would seem strange and frightening to modern eyes. For much of the medieval period, the methods of establishing guilt or innocence were very different from the careful weighing of evidence we expect today. There was, in the earlier centuries, the trial by ordeal, in which a person's guilt was tested by subjecting them to some painful or dangerous trial on the belief that God would protect the innocent. There was trial by combat, in which the matter was settled by a fight. There was the swearing of oaths, in which a person might clear their name by gathering enough others to swear to their good character. These methods faded over time, replaced gradually by trial by jury and the testimony of witnesses, but the world they belonged to was one in which truth was sought through faith and ritual as much as through reason and proof. What this meant for you in your cell was that the outcome of your case might depend on things that had nothing to do with what you had actually done, on whether you had friends willing to swear for you, on whether you could afford to make your case well, on the mood of the court, the standing of your accuser, the politics of the moment. Justice was not blind in the way we like to imagine it. It could see perfectly well who was rich and who was poor, who was well connected and who was friendless, and it treated them accordingly. And so the wait stretched on, shapeless and uncertain. You did not know when your trial would come. You did not know when it came, how it would be decided, or by what strange and ancient process. You did not know whether the witnesses against you would appear, or whether your own would, or whether the whole thing might be delayed yet again for reasons no one bothered to explain to a prisoner. The waiting was not a defined sentence with an end you could count toward. It was an open question hanging over you in the dark, and the not knowing was its own particular torment, perhaps the worst of all the torments the dungeon had to offer. There is a mercy in our modern frustrations that we rarely recognize. We complain, and rightly, about the slowness of courts and the unfairness of systems, and we should keep working to make them better. But you tonight are not waiting in the cold dark for a comet of a judge who may not come for half a year. You are not facing an ordeal by fire or a contest of swords. You live in a world that has tried, however imperfectly, to make justice something steadier and fairer than the medieval mind could ever have imagined. Let that thought sit gently with you, and let the long, shapeless waiting of the dungeon make your own night, with its certain and gentle progress toward a certain and gentle morning, feel like the gift it is. It would be wrong to leave you with the impression that the medieval world was nothing but cold cruelty, that the law was only a machine for grinding the unlucky into the dark. For all its harshness, that world also held, woven right through its laws and customs, certain strange and beautiful escape hatches, certain cracks in the stone through which mercy could sometimes flow. They are some of the most fascinating things in this whole story, and a fitting thing to dwell on as our journey gentles toward its end. The first and most remarkable of these was the right of sanctuary. In much of medieval Europe, a person fleeing the law, even a person who had committed a real and serious crime, could reach a church and claim its protection, and within those walls, for a time, they could not be touched. The church was holy ground, and to drag a person from it by force was itself a grave offense against God. And so a fugitive who made it to the altar, who laid hold of the great iron ring on the church door, who crossed that sacred threshold, won themselves a breathing space that the ordinary machinery of justice could not easily take from them. picture the desperate scene of it. The pursued man running for the church, the pursuers close behind, and the whole question of his fate hanging on whether his hand could close on that iron ring before theirs closed on him. Sanctuary was not freedom, and it was not forever. There were rules, and time limits, and conditions. In some times and places, a person who had claimed sanctuary might be required to confess their crime and then to leave the kingdom entirely, to abjure the realm, walking to the coast by an appointed road and taking ship into exile, never to return. It was a hard mercy, this trading of one's whole country for one's life, but it was mercy nonetheless, a way out that did not end in the cell or on the scaffold, and for many a desperate soul, that iron ring on the church door was the difference between a future and none at all. Then there was the curious institution that came to be called benefit of clergy. In its origins, this was the simple principle that a man of the church should be tried by the church's own courts rather than the ordinary ones, and the church's courts, crucially, could not put a man to death. Over time, the test of whether one belonged to the church became in some places startlingly mechanical. It came down, famously, to whether a person could read. A prisoner who could read a particular passage of Scripture might, by that proof of his learning, claim the protection of the church courts and so escape the gallows. The passage so often used for this test became known with grim humor as the neck verse, because the ability to read it could save your neck. There is something almost absurd about it, that literacy itself could be the line between life and death, but it meant that learning in that hard world was quite literally a kind of armor. And above and beyond all these stood the oldest mercy of all, the pardon. The king, or the great lord, or the church could simply choose to forgive, to lift the sentence, to open the cell and let the prisoner walk free by nothing but an act of will from someone with the power to grant it. Pardons might be bought or earned through service, or granted as acts of royal generosity on great occasions, or won through the patient pleading of friends and family. The whole grim apparatus of the law, the courts and the cells, and the slow turning wheels of justice could be overridden in a moment by a single word of mercy from on high. It was arbitrary, and it favored the connected and the fortunate, as everything did. But it was also sometimes simply mercy, and for the person it reached, that was all that mattered. These cracks in the law remind us of something important, something I would like you to carry down into sleep with you. Even in that hard and frightening world, the impulse toward mercy survived. People built it right into their laws, made room for it, gave the desperate fugitive his iron ring, and the learned man his neck verse, and the condemned soul his hope of pardon. The medieval world could be terribly cruel, and we have spent all night honoring the suffering it caused. But it was not only cruel, it also reached again and again, in its strange and imperfect ways, toward forgiveness. And that reaching, that stubborn human insistence that there should always be some way back from the dark, is one of the gentler truths to hold on to as the night closes around you. So let mercy be the note we rest on here, not the cold and the chains, not the fever and the forgetting, but the iron ring on the church door, the breathing space, the open hand, the word of pardon that lifts the sentence and lets the prisoner climb back up into the light. There is always, in the end, a way back toward the warmth. You found yours simply by lying down tonight, and it is waiting for you now, soft and certain, just on the other side of sleep. I have promised you throughout this telling that we would handle the darkest matters gently, and now we come to the darkest of them, the thing the imagination always reaches for when it pictures a dungeon. I mean the practice of putting questions to a prisoner by force, and I will keep my promise. We will speak of it carefully and from a distance, and we will not linger, because the purpose of this telling is rest, not horror. Here, as everywhere, the truth is more complicated than the films suggest. The dramatic torture chamber, with its array of fearsome devices, was not a feature of every dungeon, or even most of them. For the ordinary prisoner, the debtor, the accused thief, the person caught up in some local quarrel, it played no part at all. The vast machinery of pain that we associate with the medieval dungeon was reserved where it existed for particular kinds of cases. Matters of suspected treason against the crown or heresy against the church, the crimes that the powerful feared most and pursued most relentlessly. The grim logic behind it was this. In a legal world that placed great weight on confession, that sometimes held a confession to be the surest proof of all, there was a terrible temptation to extract that confession by force. If a person could be made to admit their guilt, the difficult business of proving it through evidence and witnesses could be set aside. And so, in certain serious cases and certain places, the law permitted the questioning of prisoners under duress, hedged about with rules and conditions that look, to us, like the faintest possible restraint on something that should never have been allowed at all. But I want to draw your attention away from the instruments, which the imagination dwells on too eagerly, and toward something quieter and, I think, more genuinely terrible. The greatest weight of suffering in the dungeon was almost never the dramatic, the sudden, the violent. It was the slow, it was the cold, and the hunger, and the fever, and the dark, and the endless waiting, the things we have spent all night describing. The famous Chamber of Horrors, where it existed at all, touched only a few. The slow cruelty of the ordinary cell touched nearly everyone and killed far, far more. This is, in its way, the most important correction we can make to the imagined dungeon. We picture the dungeon as a place of active, theatrical cruelty, of villains inflicting pain. The reality was a place of passive, administrative cruelty, of people being slowly destroyed, not by what was done to them, but by what was withheld. No warmth, no food, no light, no care, no answer to the question of when or whether it would ever end. You did not need a torturer to die in a medieval dungeon. You needed only to be forgotten there long enough, and the cold, and the damp, and the hunger, and the small invisible creatures would do all the rest, patiently, in the dark, asking no questions at all. Let us leave this darkest room now, and close its doors softly behind us, and not look back. You are safe, you are warm. No one is asking anything of you tonight, but that you rest. The worst things human beings have done to one another belong to a different time and a different place, and you are visiting them only as a traveler visits a ruin from a safe distance, free to leave whenever you wish. Breathe out slowly and let the door of that room close. We are nearly at the end of our descent, and what remains is gentler. Before we begin our climb back toward the light, let us spend a little while among the most famous of these places, because the great prisons of history have a strange power over the imagination, and there is something soothing in the way they have outlasted everyone who suffered in them. The most famous of them all, in the English speaking world at least, is surely the Tower of London. And here, once again, the reality unsettles the legends. The tower was never simply a prison. It was a royal palace, a fortress, a treasury, a mint, an armory, even for a time, a menagerie of exotic beasts. Imprisonment was only one of its many functions, and for much of its history, a relatively minor one. The prisoners it held were very often people of the highest rank: fallen queens and disgraced courtiers, claimants to the throne and enemies of the crown, men and women whose imprisonment was a matter of state rather than of common crime, and their captivity was frequently nothing like the dungeon of our imagination. A high ranking prisoner in the tower might be lodged in comfortable rooms, attended by their own servants, supplied with good food and wine and books, permitted to walk in the gardens and receive visitors. Their imprisonment was guaranteed not by squalor, but by the simple impossibility of escape from one of the strongest fortresses in the land. Some carved their names and their sorrows into the stone walls of their chambers, and those carvings can still be seen today, a quiet and intimate message across the centuries from people who had all the time in the world and nothing to do with it. But wait and think and scratch their grief into the wall. Across the sea in Paris, there stood the Bastille, which would become, in the end, the most famous prison of all, though more for how it ended than for what it was. By the time an angry crowd stormed it and tore it down, it had become in the public mind a symbol of cruelty and arbitrary power, of people locked away on the king's whim with no trial and no recourse. And yet, in its final years, the reality was almost comically at odds with the legend. When the crowd broke in, expecting to free a multitude of suffering wretches, they found only a handful of prisoners, some of them living in conditions that, by the standards of the age, were really quite comfortable. The Bastille was hated less for what it actually was than for what it represented. Sometimes the symbol matters more than the stone, but these great and famous places, with their royal prisoners and their carved walls and their dramatic ends, are not really the heart of our story tonight. They are the exceptions, the prisons grand enough to hold the famous and to be remembered. The true story of the medieval dungeon is not written in the Tower or the Bastille. It is written in 1,000 forgotten cells beneath 1,000 ordinary castles and town gates and bishops' palaces, in the small grim holding rooms of places whose names have not survived at all. And in those forgotten cells sat forgotten people, the debtors and the accused and the inconvenient, the ordinary men and women whose suffering left no carving on any wall and no entry in any chronicle. These are the people this channel has always cared about most. Not the kings and queens whose every move was recorded, but the nameless ones, the ones who lived and suffered and died without a single line written about them, whose existence we can only reach by imagining our way into the cold and the dark where they once sat. Tonight, in a small way, by picturing them, by giving them our drowsy and compassionate attention, we remember them a little. We undo for just a moment the forgetting that the oubliette was named for. And there is a strange comfort in that, I think, both for them and for us. No one, in the end, is entirely forgotten, so long as someone, somewhere, is still willing to imagine their way down the cold stair and sit with them a while in the dark. We have spoken throughout this telling as though the dungeon were a single thing, a cell beneath a castle, and for the sake of a clear story that has served us well. But the truth, as ever, is richer and more various. The medieval world held its prisoners in a great many different kinds of place, and each had its own particular character, its own particular miseries, and here and there its own small mercies. Let us walk among them now gently, as our descent gives way to a slower wandering through the world we have built. There was, first, the castle dungeon we have been imagining, the holding place of the great fortress, where the Lord kept his prisoners of war and his political rivals and the troublemakers of the lands he ruled. But the castle was only one kind of cage among many. Far more common, in truth, far closer to the lives of ordinary people, was the town jail. Every town of any size needed somewhere to hold the drunk, the brawler, the thief, the debtor, the person awaiting the next sitting of the court. And so towns made do with what they had. A strong room in the town hall, a chamber above or beside one of the gates in the town wall, which were already built strong and already watched, a cellar beneath some official building. These were rough, crowded, makeshift places, and the great mass of ordinary imprisonment happened not in the dramatic castle, but in these humble municipal cages, all but forgotten by history. Then there was the prison of the church, which is a thing we rarely think about, and which deserves a moment of our drowsy attention. The medieval church was a power in its own right, with its own laws and its own courts, and naturally, its own prisons. Bishops had their cells, monasteries had their places of confinement, where a monk who had broken his vows or his rules might be shut away to contemplate his failings. The church's prisons could be as grim as any, but they carried their own particular flavor, for here imprisonment was often framed not merely as holding or punishment, but as something closer to penance, a confinement of the body intended to work upon the soul. A person might be walled into a small cell and left there with their prayers, the isolation itself meant as a kind of medicine for the spirit. Whether it healed or simply broke depended no doubt on the person and the cell. There were debtors' prisons, which in time became institutions all their own, whole buildings dedicated to the particular and hopeless misery of those who owed money they could not pay. There were the cells attached to the courts themselves, the holding rooms where the accused waited out the hours before their cases were heard. There were in some places the cages quite literally in the open, the pillory and the stocks set up in the marketplace, which were less prisons than instruments of public shame, though a person clamped into them for days, exposed to the weather and the crowd, suffered a real and bodily ordeal. And there were the truly informal places, the cellars and outbuildings, and locked rooms where a powerful person might simply keep someone they wished to keep, with no court and no charge and no record, on nothing but their own authority and the strength of their own walls. These leave the faintest trace in history, precisely because they were private and unofficial, but they were surely common enough, for power has always found ways to hold those it wishes to hold, with or without the blessing of any law. What unites all these many cages, from the grandest castle to the meanest town lockup to the bishop's penitential cell, is the thread we have been following all night. In nearly all of them, the comfort and the survival of the prisoner was an afterthought at best. They were places of holding, of waiting, of shame, of penance, of punishment, but only very rarely places that took any real responsibility for keeping the held person alive and whole. The variety was enormous. The underlying indifference was nearly universal. And so, wherever you found yourself caged in the medieval world, by whatever authority and in whatever kind of room, the same patient enemies waited for you: the cold, the damp, the hunger, the fever, the forgetting. Let all these many rooms blur together now, and then let them fade. The castle cell and the gatehouse cage, and the cellar beneath the town hall, the bishop's cell and the debtor's ward, and the cold stone room with no name at all. Let them drift away into the great gray distance of the past, where they can no longer touch anyone, where their locks have all rusted open, and their walls have all fallen down, and the only thing left of them is the quiet story we tell, here, in the warm, on our slow way down to sleep. We have spoken of the body in the dungeon, of the cold, and the hunger, and the fever, but there is one more aspect of survival that we have only touched upon, and it is perhaps the most haunting of all. I mean the survival of the mind, because even if your body endured, even if you were among the fortunate few who were fed and sheltered well enough to live, there remained the long and patient assault upon the spirit, the slow work of the dark upon the soul. Consider what the dungeon took from a person beyond their freedom. It took the sky, it took the sun and the moon, and the changing of the light that tells us, deep in our animal selves, where we are in the day and the year. It took the faces of the people they loved. It took the small rhythms of ordinary life, the work and the meals and the greetings and the rest, the thousand tiny things that, woven together, make up the fabric of a self. Strip all of that away, leave a person alone in the dark, with nothing but their own thoughts and the cold stone and the dripping water, and you will find that the mind, deprived of the world, begins to turn upon itself. Time, as we have said, would lose its shape, and a mind cut loose from time is a mind in danger. The hours would stretch and blur. The same thoughts would circle endlessly, worn smooth as river stones by repetition. Memories would grow unnaturally vivid, the prisoner living more in the recalled past than in the unbearable present, walking again through remembered streets, sitting again at remembered tables, until the line between memory and dream began to soften and fade. Some prisoners, it was said, talked to people who were not there. Some heard sounds in the silence. The mind, starved of real things to work upon, will sometimes begin to manufacture its own. And yet, here too, the human spirit reveals its astonishing stubbornness. For every prisoner the dark broke, there were others who found, somewhere in themselves, the strength to endure. Some held fast to their faith, praying in the dark, finding in their belief a companionship that no cell could take from them. Some occupied their minds with whatever they could, composing verses they had no way to write down, working through problems, telling themselves stories, counting and recounting the stones of their cell simply to give the hours a shape. Some clung to a single fierce hope, a person they meant to see again, a wrong they meant to right, a future they refused to stop believing in. The mind that the dungeon sought to empty could, in the strongest, become a fortress of its own, a place the cold could not reach. There is a lesson in that, I think, gentle as it is. The human capacity to endure is greater than we usually have any cause to discover. People have survived things that seem, from the comfort of a warm bed, utterly unsurvivable. They have held onto themselves in the dark, kept some small flame of who they were burning where there was no light at all, and walked back out into the world, blinking and changed but still themselves. We are tougher than we know, you and I. We carry within us, all of us, more strength than we will ever, with any luck, be called upon to use. It is a quiet and reassuring thing to remember as the day's small troubles fade and the night closes softly around you. Whatever you are carrying, you are stronger than it. You always have been. And now, at last, let us talk of leaving, for our long descent is nearly done, and it is time to begin our climb back toward the light. How did a person get out of a medieval dungeon? There were, in truth, only a handful of doors, and not all of them led anywhere good. The first and happiest door was release. Your trial came, and you were found innocent, or your debt was paid, or your ransom was met, or whoever had wanted you held simply no longer wanted it. And so the great key turned, the heavy door swung open, and you climbed the stair you had been carried down, however many weeks or months or years before, and stepped out, blinking and unsteady, into a world that seemed almost unbearably bright and loud and alive after the long gray silence below. For those fortunate enough to walk through it, this door changed everything. They returned to their families, their trades, their lives, marked forever by what they had endured, but free, and breathing the open air, and able at last to lift their faces to the sun. The second door was ransom, which for the high-born prisoner of war was often the whole point of their captivity. They were worth more alive than dead, more freed than held, and so their families and allies would gather the staggering sums required and buy them back, and the whole grim business would end as a transaction, a matter of coin changing hands. For these prisoners, the dungeon was a kind of expensive waiting room, unpleasant but survivable, and the door of ransom was for them almost always the one they walked through in the end. The third door was escape, the rarest and most dramatic of them all, the stuff of legend precisely because it happened so seldom. The medieval prison was not, for the most part, easy to escape. The walls were thick, the locks were strong, the guards were watchful, and a prisoner weakened by cold and hunger was in no condition for daring feats. And yet it happened. There are tales scattered through the centuries of prisoners who bribed their guards, who tunneled through soft stone, who slipped their irons, who were smuggled out by loyal friends, who simply waited for the one moment of carelessness and seized it. These escapes have come down to us as stories of cleverness and courage, and we love them because they are the rare cases where the prisoner won. But there was a fourth door, and it was, in truth, the one through which the greatest number of prisoners finally passed. It was death. Not the dramatic death of the executioner's block, though that came for some, but the quiet death of the cell itself. Death by fever, death by cold, death by the slow starvation of a body never given enough, death by the simple accumulation of misery upon misery, until there was nothing left to hold the spark of life in place. For a great many of the people who went down into the medieval dungeon, this was the door they left by, and they left through it without ceremony, their passing noted, if at all, in a single line of some forgotten ledger. And this, in the end, is the truest answer to our question. Why would you not survive a medieval dungeon? Because the dungeon was built in its quiet and careless way for not surviving, not as an act of deliberate murder, but as a place where survival was simply never the priority, never anyone's responsibility, never the thing the building was for. You would not survive because everything about the place, the cold and the damp and the dark and the hunger and the fever and the forgetting, conspired patiently against survival, and because for most of those who went down, no one with the power to help them ever quite got around to caring whether they lived or died. The dungeon did not need to kill you, it only needed to wait, and it was very, very good at waiting. But you tonight are not waiting for any of those doors. You are already free, already warm, already safe in the one place in all the world that is most entirely your own. The only door ahead of you is the soft door of sleep, and it opens onto nothing but rest. So let us walk toward it now, slowly, gently, leaving the cold stone behind us for good. We have come a long way down together tonight, you and I, and now we have climbed all the way back up. We have stood at the edge of the oubliette and felt the cold breath rising from it. We have sat in the gray half light of the ordinary cell, among the debtors and the accused and the forgotten. We have learned that the dungeon was not, after all, the place of torches and skeletons we imagined, but something stranger and quieter and sadder. A waiting room with no clock, a place where the cruelty was mostly in the things withheld rather than the things done, a place where the cold and the damp and the small invisible creatures did the patient work that no one else was paid to do. And we have remembered gently the ordinary people who pass through these places, not the kings and queens whose stories fill the chronicles, but the nameless ones, the weaver and the baker and the farmer who came to town to sell a cart of turnips, the people who fell on the wrong side of luck or law or another person's grudge, and found themselves carried down the cold stair into the dark. We have given them, for a little while, our drowsy and compassionate attention, and in doing so we have undone, just a little, the forgetting that was meant to swallow them. Now let all of it grow soft and distant. Let the cold stone fade. Let the gray light dim. Let the whole long story drift away from you like a boat slipping its mooring and gliding out onto still, dark water, growing smaller and smaller until it is only a shape on the horizon, and then not even that. You do not need to hold on to any of it. It has done its quiet work, which was only ever to carry you here, to this drowsy edge, to this soft and sinking place just before sleep. Feel how warm you are. Feel how dry and how safe and how free. Feel the weight of your own body settling deeper into the bed, every muscle letting go, every small holding on releasing its grip. There is nowhere you must be. There is nothing you must do. The door is locked from your side, and the morning is waiting at its usual hour, and between here and there is nothing but rest, soft and certain and entirely your own. Your breathing has slowed, your thoughts have slowed. The cold stare and the dark cell are far behind you now, fading into the great quiet country of history, where all the old sorrows go to rest at last. And you are here in the warm, in the safe, in the now, drifting gently down towards sleep like a feather settling onto still water. Thank you for traveling down into the dark with me tonight, and for trusting me to bring you safely back up again. If you are still awake, even a little, let your eyes close now, and let the last of the day go with them. If this journey helped you rest, you might consider subscribing so that the next one finds its way to you when you need it. And remember, if you have not yet drifted off entirely, to leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what the hour is there. I do so love to imagine all of you scattered across the sleeping world, closing your eyes to the same quiet story. But there is nothing more you need to do now. Nothing at all. The story is over, and the night is yours, and you have earned every moment of the rest that is coming. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep deep and sleep warm, and let the long, dark country of history keep its sorrows to itself until you wake. Rest easy. Sleep well. This is Drowsy History.